So the Hebrew or Judaic Christian religion is not about a monotheistic God. It's not about one God, but rather many gods, as I have just proven in part 1. So the Eloiym of the Bible is without question talking about a council of gods, many gods, not just one God. They are the council of El, the Father God, the most supreme God of all the gods, El. In fact, polytheistic gods are found in the very etymology of other words that we use for God, namely deity. Our word deity is exactly like our word day, and our day consists both of day and night. The two polar opposites within one. They are bipolar of each other. So the deity comes from the dios, which comes from the dia. The dia means two or apart, just like the word dos, which means two. Exactly like the word deuce. This is why dice have two die that are split in two. And this is why we have words like diagonal or dice, which means to slice, like in two. So the die gives us words like divide or divorce, which means to separate and divide. And the die gives us our word dimension, which is the two polar opposite worlds of each other. And the die gives us our word dissect, which means to cut apart. And another cognitive word is duel, which means the two. And of course, this is why we have the dynamic duo. And of course, this gives us our word double. And speaking of the two bulls, or the bi-bulls, let me explain the meaning behind the book of Deuteronomy. It means two. That's why it's known as the second law. Oh, by the way, now you'll understand why the Deutsche Bank has the symbol of the two, the divide. And that's exactly why their headquarters in Germany has the twin towers, or the dual towers. So this is why the deity gives us our divinity. In fact, this is why Princess Diana was known as Princess Di. She is named after Diana, who was the Roman moon goddess. The moon goddess of the crossroads, which is exactly why Diana was killed on the crossroads. So now you'll understand why the state of Indiana or Indiana is the state of the crossroads. So the sun and the moon are dualistic in nature, and they are actually dualistic within themselves. So to the ancients, the sun seemed to go to the underworld and then re-rose again. Exactly like the moon, which also within itself carries the dualistic principle of black and white, the dualistic principle of a full moon and a black empty moon. So this very basic principle of nature, or should I say this dualistic principle of nature, like the day and night or the winter and summer, is the very base and foundation and the very root meaning behind the word for the god named Zeus. And of course Zeus is the son of God, which makes him number 2. And ultimately he takes his name from the ancient worship of Dione. And you can try to disassemble my etymology if you want to, but the truth is the word Jesus is Jesus. It comes from Zeus. And you'll notice, of course, that Jesus or Jesus is the Son of God as well, making him number 2. and you'll always see that Jesus will always be clothed in a dualistic form and color of clothing. He will have the red and the white, or the red and the blue. So like I have stated in the past, going back 6,000 years ago, the ancient worship of the Ugaritic Cana-Phoenician bull god El was known as El, the double L's, or the two pillars, the number two. I mean, this is why today even the house of Taurus is the second house. So this is why the Hebrew alphabet is divided, or divided, into the 11, or the L even. So this is why when we look at the Eloiym of the Bible, is a fire and ice story of the dualistic polarities, or the dual worlds that exist within our one world. So our day, or deity of two, is the entire reason that the Bible, or the two bulls, is all about the two bulls. It's all about the two realms, or the two dimensions, thus the dualistic polarity that we find throughout the entire Bible. Now, in order to read the book of the Bible, you must first open it, so therefore you must first divide it in order to open it. And the first thing you'll find once again is the book is yet divided again between the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the red and the blue. So this is why we have the story in the Bible about heaven and hell, the bull of heaven and the Bible of hell. And the dualistic story of heaven and hell, or the polarities, is reflected in Satan, the devil, and Jesus, the bad and the good. And this story of division is told in one of the main characters of the Bible, King David, the king of Israel. And actually, the very word David means divide. And this is why King David, or King Divide, has the symbol of division, the Star of David, which is the Star of Divide. And that's why all the stories about King David is about division. From the small David fighting the huge Goliath to the decapitation of the head, the division. And that's exactly why they tell you that King David has a kingdom that is divided. And the division exists to this very day. And the story of divide continues with King Solomon. Sol-mon, which means the soul of the sun and the mon of the moon. Again, the dualistic polarities of the sun and the moon, which is why King Solomon has the twin pillars. And when we look at the Hebrew Ark of the Covenant, you'll once again realize that we're talking about the dualistic polarities of the two angels on top, which is Michael, the angel of the sun, and Gabriel, the angel of the moon. Once again, the division of the moon and the sun. And the story of division is also told in the story of Cain and Abel, who represent the red and the blue, or the sun and the moon. The story of the struggling brothers, or the twins, that fight one another to see who will rule and wear the crown. It's the story of the battling seasons. And this story can also be found in Jacob and Esau. So this is why the story of the world around us is the matrix, and the matrix is about the red and the blue, the truth and the lies, the red and the blue that fight and struggle with one another. So this is why when you play games or sports and you battle one another, You are fighting from the two sides, either the left or the right. You're either fighting on the red or the blue. You're fighting for the sun or the moon, the dark or the light, the wrong or the right. And this is why our political system battles one another. We have the Republicans and the Democrats. And that's why their colors are represented by the red and the blue. The ray of the sun and the day of the moon. The day and the night, the sun and the moon that battle and struggle to see who will rule. Now, remember I was telling you that the Ark of the Covenant is about the division of the two. Now, let's hear from Jeff Benner explain it from a Hebrew perspective.
What is the concrete meaning of berit? Meat. Meat. That's weird. Have you ever heard that before? The root is bara, which means to have meat. It's related to another word meaning fat. You've heard of the term, there's the word berit. Okay, the verb bara means to choose, select meat, choice meat. How many of you ever heard the term making a covenant? I will make a covenant with you. That's right, it's not make. The Hebrew is karat berit. Karat means to cut the meat. To cut the meat. Whenever they did a covenant, what would they do? Got to remember, we're thinking in their culture. What would they do? They would cut it in half. They would shed the blood. The blood could be collected for part of the ceremony. But they would take an animal and cut it in half. Remember that story with Abraham? When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. He took the pieces and split them into two.
So you see, again, we're talking about the division, the divide, the karat berit. So let me explain the truth behind the karat, the cutting of the meat. The meat represents the life force, thus represented by an animal. And of course, a human is also an animal. The animal, or the meat, represents the life force of the universe, or the world that we live in. So the meat is the animals of the zoo, or the zodiac, the life force. And of course, the zodiac, you'll notice, is karat, or cut, or divided. And of course, the human animal itself is divided, or bipolar. It is a dualistic layout of the human anatomy. So our life is bipolar or dualistic, the beginning and the end, the life and the death, which is the whole subject and the whole entire principle behind the meaning of the Bible. Thus, the sower and the reaper, or the Alpha and the Omega, or the Aleph and the Tav. So the key that opens the door to eternal life is the act of reproduction, having offspring or children that reproduce and give eternal life, even after death. That's why the whole story of the Bible is about the rebirth in springtime, thus separating the old from the new. Thus the anthropomorphic story of Jesus. So Jesus is sacrificed upon the cross of the zodiac of the annual year that is cut or divided. His blood represents the life force of nature and eternal life. Thus the death and rebirth of Jesus. Notice how they sacrifice him in the mid-L of the three pillars. And although you may not recognize the three pillars, you have seen them your entire life. So the three is represented by the 9th hour when Jesus was sacrificed, which is the three, the Aries, the equinox of springtime, or the Passover of Aviv. This is nature's time to separate the old from the new.